I'm here at the Pool of Siloam, in Hebrew, Brechat HaShiloach. This pool is mentioned already in the First Temple period as a major water source for Jerusalem. Mind you, this pool is not really a source. It is a big cistern, but the water comes from another place, which is about 500 meters away from us, perhaps a little less. And this is the Gihon spring, the traditional water source, the source of life for Jerusalem in antiquity. Now, Jerusalem had several sources of water in antiquity, beginning with the Gihon spring, but there was another spring nearby called Enero. And perhaps they also used in the old times, they also used some water cisterns, and some of them were actually found, but not in here. Now, the story of this water cistern, of this pool, begins already in the Canaanite period. Jerusalem was established as a city in the 18th century BC. That is 3,800 years ago by the Canaanites, the pagans who established here a city in the 18th century BC. The earliest phase in this reservoir, in this water cistern, is actually very old, 3,800 years ago in the Middle Bronze Age, or the Middle Canaanite period, when Jerusalem was established as a city. Already back then, there seems to be a reservoir here. And we don't know the name of that reservoir, but we know that it got its water from the Gihon spring via a tunnel which ends right here next to me. So a reservoir built by the Canaanites is supposedly here. The reason I'm not so certain about that is because the excavations here didn't go deep enough to find the real ancient finds here. But what we do have here are remains from the First Temple period. About 1,000 years after the Canaanites, this place served as a reservoir in biblical Jerusalem in the time of King Hezekiah, Chizkiyahu in Hebrew. In the time of Hezekiah, a tunnel was dug under the city of David, and it took the water from the Gihon spring in a very sinuous path down here to a reservoir. Again, we don't have the actual reservoir here, but we have found a dam wall next to us, which is from the First Temple period. So there must have been a reservoir here. But the real story is in the Second Temple period, because what we see here belongs to the Second Temple period, to be more precise, to the end of the Second Temple period, the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. And here we can see a series of steps. It's a flight of steps, and they have a very unique feature. I'm sitting here on a very wide step, and then we have a narrow step, another narrow step, another one, and another. So we have 4 narrow steps, and then again down there, it's a wide step again. This type of arrangement of stairs is very typical to the end of the Second Temple period in Jerusalem. We can see something similar on the staircase leading to the Hulda gates in the southern wall excavations leading to the temple itself. We can see similar things in tombs from the Second Temple period. We can see it also in staircases leading down to mikvaot, ritual baths. So this is definitely a Second Temple period staircase. Its lower structure, its lower phase is from around the year 100 BC, so it's Hasmonean. These steps, what we see here, the stone staircase that we see here, is actually slightly later, maybe from the time of King Herod, maybe slightly even later to King Herod. It's around the beginning of the 1st century AD. And that's interesting because this is what people in the time of Jesus would see in Jerusalem. And indeed, when we open the New Testament in the Gospel of John, There's a beautiful story about Jesus walking around in Jerusalem and suddenly meeting a blind person. And he cures that blind person. How does he do that? He takes a little earth, a little amount of earth, he spits on it, he makes mud out of it, and he smears it on his eyelids, and then he tells him, go and wash at the pool of Siloam. And the blind man goes to the pool of Siloam, he washes his face, he washes his eyes, maybe even immerses himself in the water, and suddenly he's able to see again. So this is the famous story about the healing of the blind man in Jerusalem. Now, I said that perhaps the blind man wasn't just washing his face, because the Greek term used in the New Testament can be interpreted as washing, cleaning someone's body, but also perhaps as immersing his body in water. So the question is, was there a place for baptism, for immersion, ritual immersion in the Jewish sense in the Second Temple period? Some claim that yes, indeed, that was the case. Let me show it to you. When the archaeologists excavated here and found this magnificent staircase of this huge reservoir from the Second Temple period, they noticed something interesting. In the stairs, we can see, for instance, here and here, we can see holes, round holes. Now, they were meticulously performed. They were done with care. It's not broken. And the question is, what was the purpose of that? One of the suggestions is that maybe, perhaps, wooden poles were stuck into it, holding some kind of a cover, allowing people to immerse themselves in water, obviously naked, that's according to the Jewish law, and basically purify themselves. We don't have any written sources talking explicitly about that, but we do know that during times of pilgrimage, the three main festivals in Judaism in the Second Temple period, tens of thousands of Jews would come. They would camp outside the city. They would have to drink, clean themselves, immerse themselves in water to purify themselves before they go to the temple. This place, the Siloam pool, may have been one of the places where large numbers of pilgrims would be coming, cleansing themselves, purifying themselves, and then going up to the temple. Now, how big was this reservoir, this pool in the Second Temple period? Well, when you look around you, you can see the flight of steps. This is just one side of the pool, and it's about 50 meters long. But we know that most of the pool is still covered under this. Now, that looks like just a pile of earth, but this is an archaeological site on top of which there's a modern garden belonging to the Greek Orthodox Church. So if we ever excavate all this land, all this earth, what we will find here is the continuation of the pool. Now, assuming that this side is an indication to the size, the length of the other sides, it means that it's about 50 meters by 50 meters. Hence, it's about 2,500 square meters. It's quite big, actually. What we see here is less than 10% of what's there to see. But maybe sometime in the future, once it's excavated, we will have the ability to see the site as it would have been in the time of the Second Temple period. Now, you probably ask yourself, How do we know that this is indeed the pool of Siloam? Well, the pool of Siloam, Brechat HaShiloach, or Brechat HaShelach, is mentioned already in the ancient Jewish sources, namely in the Bible. And in the book of Nehemiah in Hebrew, a book that tells us about the building of the walls of Jerusalem in the 5th century BC, when the Jews returned from Persia, from the territories of the ancient Babylonian Empire, and they came back to their land in the Persian era. They rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, they rebuilt the city, they rebuilt the temple. And the book of Nehemiah, gives us a vivid, detailed description of the path of the wall of Nehemiah. Now, along the walls, the book of Nehemiah mentions some points, buildings, houses, topographical sites. We can identify them, so we can actually follow the path of the wall and identify where each part was built. Is it in the north? Is it in the south? So that's what we do. We read it, and suddenly, when it gets to the south end of the city of David, the Bible mentions that the pool of Siloam is located there. Now, we are here in the southern end of the city of David. We have a huge pool dating back to the Canaanite period, First Temple period, and Second Temple period. There's no other alternative. This must be the pool of Siloam. We have found it. So we have here a very nice story from the New Testament. But is that it? What about the spiritual significance of this story? Well, to fully understand the significance of the story of the healing of the blind man here in the pool of Siloam, we must go now to the other side of the old city of Jerusalem, to the north area, north of the Temple Mount. There, we will find another reservoir, another pool from the Second Temple period. And when we understand what happened there, this will reflect on our story. Then and only then will we have the complete understanding of the meaning behind the story of the healing of the blind man here in the pool of Siloam. Let's go. I'm now standing inside the old city of Jerusalem in a place called Bethesda, or St. Anne's Church, which is actually not that accurate. St. Anne's Church and Monastery would be more accurate. This compound belongs to the White Fathers. The White Fathers are a French Catholic order of monks established in the 19th century in France. The French government got this place in the middle of the 19th century, and it gave it to the White Fathers to run the site. And so they are in control here till this day. And they're also responsible of the archaeological digs that were conducted here in the past. Right behind me, you can actually see the founder of the White Fathers order. His name is Father Lavigerie. So his bust, his statue, is right over there behind my back. In the excavations that were conducted here in the 19th century and the 20th century, we have found many interesting finds from different periods in the history of this site. We have found remains from the Second Temple period, also remains from the late Roman period, the time immediately after the destruction of the Second Temple, the Byzantine period, and the Crusader period. And of course, we also have the modern buildings surrounding us that, interestingly enough, make use of the older Crusader period buildings and form a unique, unified architecture on site. Now, in the Second Temple period, the site was actually outside the walls, say in the time of Jesus, until the Great Revolt against the Romans. When the Great Revolt against the Romans began, a wall known as the Third Wall was hastily built, and it protected also that site. But in the time of Jesus, it was outside the city, not too far, though, from the northern wall of the Temple Mount, which is right near us. So what do we have here? Let me take you to the excavations, and I'll show you what we have found from different periods in the history of this magnificent site in the old city of Jerusalem. The earliest finds here are dating from the Second Temple period. Yes, there are those who claim that some of the finds here actually belong to the First Temple period, but actually there's not much indication to that. So what we know for sure is that the main ancient remains here are from the Second Temple period, from the end of the Second Temple period. And this is exactly what you see behind me, down below, not the walls, but the gap, the hole in the ground. This hole in the ground was created by the archaeologists when they dug down. What we see here are the remains of a large reservoir, a large pool from the time of the Second Temple, the end of the Second Temple period. And it's one of two large pools separated by a dam wall. So one pool would be on the right, where the trees are now, and the other one would be over here, and in between them, where the later walls are standing, this would be the place where the dam is, and we have found the dam wall. So basically two large pools, and they were filled by rainwater. And it's extremely important to understand the topography here, because when we look at it, it's a very low site, a very low depression. But if you look over there to the west or to the east, you can see that the terrain is much higher. And the reason is very simple. We're inside a valley, a natural valley in Jerusalem, which is filled with water during the winter time. This valley is known as Bethesda Valley. So here again, we hear about Bethesda, and we'll have to explain what Bethesda means shortly. So two large reservoirs from the Second Temple period. Now these reservoirs don't stand alone. Next to them, there's something else. Let me show you. Back in the Second Temple period, here, next to the two large reservoirs, there was an open area now littered with many, many walls all around, different ages, different times. But most interestingly, under these walls, there are underground holes quarried in bedrock, such as the one below me. Now, this is a very typical feature that we've seen already in this course in other places. It is a Jewish ritual bath. How do I know that? Well, you can see that on the sides, on the walls, there's plaster, and right there below me, there's a flight of steps. This is a typical Jewish ritual bath, a mikveh. So when we imagine this site in the Second Temple period, there's a large area with pools, and then here we have a smaller area that people can actually access. But that's not all of it, because we have here remains also from the time immediately after the destruction of the temple, from the late Roman era. So in the late Roman period, that is in the time of Aelia Capitolina, from the 2nd century AD and on, until the Byzantine period, Jerusalem was built as a new magnificent pagan city known as Aelia Capitolina. And in the city, there were many, many temples that were built. One of these temples was actually excavated right here. This is the wall. That's part of the temple, and it is dedicated, according to what archaeologists believe, to Asclepius, the god of medicine. Now, Asclepius in the east is identified with the Egyptian god Serapis. The idea is very simple. You build a temple, inside the temple there's a holy snake. The snake is the symbol of Asclepius. People who wish to be cured come to the temple, they sleep for the night, and when they wake up in the morning, they may have dreamt about the god who gave them the medicine or his advice, and they will be healed. Well, hopefully at least. So we know this type of cult from all over the Roman world, and now we also have it in Jerusalem. We've actually found here a piece of stone which is decorated with a sleeping woman and the symbol of the snake. So that is an indication that on this site, during the late Roman period, after the destruction of the temple, a certain cult actually took place here, and this is the cult of the god of medicine. This is a center of healing, pagan center of healing, in the time immediately after the destruction of the temple. This is a center of healing in the late Roman era. Now, is there any significance to that? Well, in a moment, we'll gather all the evidence together. So keep that in mind, and we'll continue to explore the other periods, later periods, let's say the Byzantine and beyond. Let's go and see that. In the Byzantine period, that is in the time when Jerusalem was controlled by the Romans who now become Christians, so we're talking about the 4th, 5th, and 6th and 7th, beginning of 7th century, this site was redeveloped by the Byzantines and a huge church was built here. That church is immediately behind me. You can see a lot of it, quite a lot, but what we can clearly see are the pillars over here. 1 and 2 and 3, these pillars belong to the main hall or the nave of the Byzantine church, which was a basilical church. That is, again, it had a main hall, a nave, and 2 aisles on the sides. We can actually see the apses of this basilica, and they're quite intact at least the lower level of these apses. From the written sources, we hear that the name of this church is Saint Mary of the Probatike. Saint Mary of the Probatike. Now, Maria, that's the name of the mother of Jesus. What does Probatike mean? Keep that in mind. We'll answer that question shortly. And finally, the last phase in this beautiful site is from the Crusader period. The Crusaders were here in the 12th century mostly, and what we see here are the remains of 2 Crusader churches. One is immediately behind me. Look over there at the excavation, and you can see this wall. This is the exterior of an apse, and there's a window in the wall. So this is a little Crusader church, but oddly enough, there's another church, much better preserved, and this is the church we can see here. Let me take you to see the facade, the entrance to this church, and there we'll learn what's the name of this church in the Crusader period. Follow me. This church that we see here was built in the 12th century. It is a typical architecture of the Romanesque style, which was very famous and popular back then in Europe, in many countries. But I'd like you to take a look at the entrance itself. There's a beautiful arch. Immediately below the arch, there's a nice inscription in Arabic. Now, that doesn't belong to our story. It was put here when the Muslims took over Jerusalem in the 12th century. They took it from the Crusaders. They turned this place into a madrasa, a place for studying Islamic law. But from the Crusader period, we also have an inscription. Above the Arabic inscription, there's a very small inscription which says in Latin, Santa Anna. So this church is Santa Anna's church. Who's Santa Anna? Who's Saint Anne? Saint Anne is the mother of Jesus. Okay, so we have here a very mixed story. It has to do probably with Jesus, with Anna, and with Mary. 3 generations: the grandmother, the mother, and the son. Let's try to put everything together now. So this site is probably very important if we have churches from the Byzantine era, from the Crusader era. What is the significance of this site? According to the Jerusalemite tradition, this site, St. Anne's, is actually connected to several stories in the New Testament. One of them is the famous healing story that took place in Jerusalem by Jesus. According to that story, which appears in the Gospel of John, we hear about Jesus visiting Jerusalem and going to a place called Bethesda pools near the Probatike. What is Probatike? Probatike means belonging to the sheep. Okay, so what did he do there? Over there are pools. And in these pools, the water is magical. Every now and then, an angel comes down from heaven and he touches the water. Once he does that, the first person to jump into the water is immediately healed. And indeed, many people gather around the pools and await the angel to touch the water. One of them is there for many years. He cannot be healed because he is unable to walk. He is a paralytic. So whenever people see the water moving, he tries to jump in, but obviously there's always someone doing it before him, jumping before. So he remains here. Jesus comes to him and he says, "Do you want to heal?" And he says, "Yes, of course I do." And he says, "Then get up and take your bed with you and go." And he does exactly that. So this is the healing of the paralytic. From a later Christian perspective, this is one of 2 important places in Jerusalem where Jesus performed a healing miracle. The other one we've mentioned when we visited the Siloam pool. There, we mentioned the healing of the blind, also told to us by the Gospel of John. So in one place, Jesus heals a paralytic, that's here. In another place, in the Siloam pool, he heals a blind man. In both places, there are places of healing, of pools, and he performs these miracles. Is that important? I mean, Jesus performed many miracles in the Gospels, so why is that so important, if at all? Well, of course, a healing place is a healing place. People, when they're sick, when they're ill, they wish to be healed. So yes, of course, it's important for everyone. But in addition, there's a deeper theological aspect to it. And that aspect brings us back to the Jewish Bible, to the book of Samuel. In the 2nd book of Samuel, we hear about King David approaching the city of Jerusalem, which is back then owned by the Jebusites, and he besieges the city. The people of Yevus, the Jebusites, stand up on the walls, looking down at King David, and they mock him, and they say that even the blind and the lame, the paralytic, will be able to stop him. So, think about it. Here, 1,000 years later, comes, according to the Christian understanding, comes the son of David, which is Jesus, and he heals a paralytic and a blind person, and they go forth and bring forward the message of the Messiah. In a sense, it's a closure of a theological circle. The blind and the lame, the blind and the paralytic, who would deter David, who would keep David out of Jerusalem, are now receiving his message. So what we have here is a complex archaeological site. As you can see, it's also complex from a religious perspective, theological perspective. The question now remains, can this place really be the place where Jesus actually performed the miracle? Is this the place where the Gospel of John refers to as probatike, or the Bethesda pools? For that, we need to find some actual corroboration, whether in the texts or in archaeology. But you remember, we already had some pieces of information that may gather up together to support that idea that indeed this is the place called probatike, or the pools of Bethesda near the probatike in the New Testament. Firstly, we mentioned that we are next to two large reservoirs from the Second Temple period, from the time of Jesus. So this is a perfect location, not too far from the temple. Secondly, I've mentioned that there are remains of a temple, pagan temple though, dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing. Is this an accident? Is this a coincidence that we hear in the Gospels about healing of people in a place called Bethesda, and suddenly we find here a temple dedicated to healing by pagan gods and so on? I don't think it's accidental. Maybe there's connection between the two. Maybe whoever decided to build the temple, the pagan temple in the Roman era, already knew about the old Jewish tradition from the time of Jesus, and therefore, when they decided to build a temple to the god of healing, to Asclepius, they decided to build it here, because there's already an ongoing tradition about healing in this place. So that may also corroborate the idea that indeed this is the place mentioned by the Gospels. But there's also some archaeology beyond the pools and everything else that I'd like to show you, an inscription this time. Come with me, I'll show you. In this quiet and peaceful courtyard, hidden from the eye, lies one of the indications for the identity of this place. This inscription was found not too far from here. It's a tombstone dating from the Byzantine period, that is, from the time immediately after the pagan Romans and before the Muslims conquered the land. And this inscription is obviously in Greek. That was the international language spoken by everyone, and of course the script is the script of that language. We can actually read this script. It says here, Theke diapherusa amos diakonu tis probatikis, meaning this is the private tomb of a man called Amos. Amos was a diakon, an official in the church of probatike. So we hear now, here again the term probatike. Probatike is a term mentioned in the New Testament, in the Gospel of John, as the place where the healing miracle took place. What does that mean? Is this a proof that this is the place from the Second Temple period? Well, I wish it was, but it isn't. But it's not too far from that. You see, the inscription is from the Byzantine period, 1,500 years ago. It means that in those days, people believed that the probatike is here. So this is a good indication that the tradition about this place as being the place of the healing miracle is going back 1,500 years, which is much better than just a couple of hundreds of years, don't you think? So now we've understood why this site is important. It is linked to the story about the healing of the paralytic in the Gospel of John. There are pools here, there are churches built to commemorate that. But there's one thing which remains, and this is the question, why is this place also known as St. Anne's or St. Mary of the Probatike? Probatike we understand, that's a story about the healing of the paralytic, but why Mary? Why not Jesus? And this brings us to another tradition, which is later than the New Testament. According to this Jerusalemite tradition, the family of Anne Anna and Joachim, the mother and father of Mary, lived here. This is where their house used to be, here in Jerusalem. So this would be the birthplace of Mary. So that is why it's known as Saint Mary of the Probatike or Saint Anne's Church. It's important to note that traditions in the Holy Land are very complex. Actually, there's another competing tradition from a later period, from the Crusader period, in Tzipori, in the Galilee, claiming that Mary's birthplace was at Tzipori. But the original tradition lies actually right here. Mind you, again, as I said, it's not from the New Testament. It is a later evolution of traditions coming from the Byzantine period. So now we have the final picture and the broader picture of this beautiful site of Bethesda, St. Anne's Church.